I lived in that apartment building for almost 7 years, long enough to know which elevator rattled, which neighbors fought every Thursday night, and exactly how cold the underground garage got during winter. And for all those years, Spot B, 19 was mine. Not kind of mine. Not usually mine. I mean legally assigned, painted on the concrete, listed in black ink on page 4 of my lease agreement, right there between trash valet fee and pet policy. B, 19 was the only reason I tolerated living downtown in the first place, because parking in Seattle is basically legalized psychological warfare. Then one Monday morning, I came home from an overnight shift, exhausted, half awake, still smelling like burnt coffee and printer toner, and there it was, a black Range Rover parked dead center in my spot like it had descended from heaven with diplomatic immunity. Custom plates, matte finish, spotless chrome rims, the kind of SUV that practically screams, I interrupt waiters before they finish speaking. I actually sat there in my car staring at it for a full minute because my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. At first I thought maybe someone parked there temporarily, maybe movers, maybe maintenance, maybe somebody made a mistake. But then I noticed the parking permit hanging from the mirror. Permanent resident permit. Somebody had approved this. I drove around the garage for 25 minutes looking for another spot, and there was nothing. Not one open space. So I ended up parking 4 blocks away near a loading dock where homeless guys were screaming at each other behind a taco place at 6 a.m. And while I walked back to my apartment in the rain, carrying 2 grocery bags and a backpack, I kept telling myself not to overreact, because sometimes people are just stupid, not malicious. So I left a note. A polite note too. Hey, I think there's been a mistake. This spot belongs to Unit 3C. Please use guest parking. Thanks. Simple. Friendly. No attitude. The next morning the Range Rover was still there, but my note was gone. That right there, that tiny detail, that's what made my stomach tighten because somebody had read it, understood it, and decided they didn't care. So I went downstairs to the leasing office and talked to the property manager, Denise. Now Denise had this corporate customer service smile that never reached her eyes, like every sentence she spoke had already been approved by HR. She pulled up my lease, clicked around for a while, frowned at the screen, then casually said, "Looks like B19 is attached to the penthouse unit now." Now, that word hit me immediately. Now, I asked her. I've parked there for 6 years. She shrugged like we were discussing weather patterns. The penthouse resident pays premium HOA privileges. There may have been a reassignment. A reassignment. Like she was talking about office furniture. I told her my lease specifically included that spot, and she gave me this long sigh. The kind adults use on children who ask too many questions. Then she printed out my file, and sure enough, there it was, parking space B19 assigned to Unit 3C. Clear as day. Even Denise looked uncomfortable for a second. But instead of fixing it, she leaned back in her chair and said, "There was probably a clerical oversight at some point. We can offer you another spot." Another spot turned out to be basically a cave at the far end of the garage near the dumpsters where the lights flickered like a horror movie and the concrete ceiling leaked rusty water whenever it rained. I said no. She smiled again. That's the only available option. And just like that, the conversation was over. No apology. No accountability. Just corporate language wrapped around a middle finger. For the next few weeks, the Range Rover stayed planted in my spot every single day. I started parking on the street because the replacement spot was so narrow my driver's side door barely opened. Then came the parking tickets. 2 in 10 days. Then somebody clipped my rear bumper overnight and drove off. No note. No cameras. No witnesses. I remember standing there staring at the scrape marks thinking, this stupid parking spot was actively costing me money now. Meanwhile, the guy in the penthouse probably had no idea any of this was happening because people like that never see the damage they cause. They just move through life assuming inconvenience is something that only happens to other people. Eventually, I decided to figure out who he was. Denise refused to tell me. Of course, privacy policy. Which is funny because apartment management only cares about privacy when it protects rich tenants. So I figured it out myself. His name was Brandon Mercer. I found it on a package sitting outside the penthouse mailroom. Quick Google search, and there he was. Owner of 2 luxury auto dealerships outside Bellevue. Local business magazine features, charity gala photos, expensive suits, fake humble smile. The whole package. And suddenly everything made sense because guys like Brandon spend their entire lives insulated from consequences. They don't ask for things, they absorb them. They walk into spaces already assuming the answer is yes. I'll admit it, for about a week I fantasized about doing something stupid. Slashing tires. Sugar in the gas tank. Keying move across the hood. You know, emotionally satisfying, legally catastrophic ideas. But every time I pictured it, I realized guys like Brandon probably expected that kind of revenge. Rich people understand anger. What they don't understand is paperwork. And that thought, that tiny little thought, ended up changing everything. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of people mess up in situations like this. Most tenants think apartment parking works on some kind of first come, first served logic, but according to standard procedure, assigned parking is usually treated as part of the leasehold agreement, meaning if your contract specifically includes a numbered space, management can't just casually yank it away because somebody richer moved in upstairs. Especially in HOA-controlled properties where parking rights are tied to separate ownership records, easements, or long-term leasing agreements. And here's the part most people never realize. Older condo buildings are often a legal Frankenstein. Over the decades, parking spots get sold separately, reassigned, bundled into HOA privileges, then forgotten about entirely. So when Denise called it a clerical oversight, what she really meant was, we assumed you wouldn't fight back. From a legal perspective, that matters. A lot. But honestly, the legal side wasn't even the most interesting part to me. The psychological side was. Because this is a psychological trap wealthy, entitled people fall into constantly. They confuse silence with surrender. Brandon saw a regular tenant driving an older Honda and assumed I'd eventually adapt, complain a little, then disappear. That's how power works in buildings like these. Small inconveniences stack up until normal people get exhausted and give in. The lesson here is, if somebody keeps pushing boundaries without consequences, they eventually stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as background scenery. And once I understood that, I stopped reacting emotionally. I started thinking structurally. Because anger burns hot for about 10 minutes. But paperwork can ruin somebody's entire month. So once I stopped thinking like an angry tenant and started thinking like a guy holding a flashlight inside a very old system, things got interesting fast. I went down to the county records office on my day off, this depressing beige building that smelled like dust, printer ink, and broken dreams, and I started digging through property maps. At first, I honestly didn't expect much. I figured maybe I'd find some technicality, maybe enough leverage to scare management into giving me the spot back. But after about 3 hours buried in microfilm scans and HOA filings, I noticed something weird. The garage spaces weren't listed under the apartment building's master ownership records. Some of them were, but not all. A handful had completely separate parcel numbers attached to them. Tiny little property parcels, including B19. I actually laughed out loud when I realized what I was looking at, because suddenly the whole situation flipped upside down. Brandon Mercer didn't own my spot. The apartment complex didn't own my spot. The HOA didn't even own my spot. B19 belonged to some holding company called North Cascade Storage LLC, which sounded less like a real business and more like a tax write-off invented by somebody's accountant in 1987. So naturally, I kept pulling records. That's when I found the registered owner, an 80-year-old retired electrician named Walter Grady living in Arizona. Apparently back during the condo conversion in the late 90s, he bought several garage spots as investment properties and completely forgotten about them. I tracked down his number after an absurd amount of internet searching and finally called him one afternoon expecting resistance. Instead, the guy answered sounding half asleep and said, "Parking spot? Hell, I haven't thought about those in 20 years. I asked if he'd consider selling B19, and there was this long silence before he said, "You serious?" I told him I was. Another pause. Then he goes, "Make me an offer." Now look, I wasn't rich. Not even close. At the time, I was budgeting groceries based on whether avocados were on sale expensive or absolutely not expensive. But I knew opportunity when I saw it. We settled at $18,000, which might sound insane for a parking spot until you've lived downtown long enough to understand that parking spaces are basically tiny pieces of urban gold. I took out a personal loan, signed the paperwork digitally, wired the money, and 2 weeks later, I officially owned B19. Legally. Completely. No HOA authority over it. No apartment management authority over it. Mine. I still remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at the ownership transfer documents with this stupid grin on my face, because for the first time in months, I wasn't trapped anymore. Brandon was. So I called him. Directly. Took me less than 5 minutes to find his business number online. His assistant answered first with that polished luxury brand tone. Mercer Automotive Group. How may I direct your call? And I told her it was regarding private property access. That got me transferred real fast. Brandon picked up sounding distracted, impatient, probably walking through one of his dealerships barking at employees. I introduced myself and said, I'm the owner of parking space B19 at the Alder Heights garage, which means your vehicle is currently trespassing. Silence. Then he laughed. Not nervous laughter either, real genuine arrogant laughter. The kind people do when they think they're listening to somebody beneath them. You serious right now? He asked. I said, completely. He kept laughing until I emailed him the deed transfer. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again, and suddenly his voice sounded very different. Calm. Controlled. Corporate. There seems to have been some confusion, he said. Ah yes, confusion. Rich people love that word when they get caught. He offered me $20,000 immediately, which told me two things. 1, he was nervous. 2, the spot mattered way more than I realized. I told him no. He bumped it to 25. Still no. Then came the question I'd been waiting for. Why would you keep a parking spot you don't even use? And honestly, I almost smiled when he asked, because that was the moment he finally understood this was no longer about parking. It was about humiliation. I told him, you'll see. Now here's where the story gets petty, but in the most beautiful possible way. Brandon's biggest competitor in the luxury car market was a dealership called Cascade European Motors, owned by this loud, hyper-aggressive guy named Vince Marino, who treated business rivalry like a blood sport. Their dealerships were constantly sniping customers from each other online, taking passive-aggressive shots in commercials, sponsoring competing charity events. Rich guy warfare, basically. So I reached out to Vince's operations manager, Ethan Cole, and explained the situation. There was this long pause on the phone before Ethan started laughing so hard, he had to mute himself. 2 days later, he came to see the spot in person driving a bright red Porsche 911 wrapped, with giant Cascade European branding across both doors. It looked like a NASCAR sponsorship exploded inside a luxury dealership. Ethan stared at B19 for maybe 10 seconds before saying, "Oh, Brandon is gonna hate this." We signed a 3-year lease agreement that afternoon. $800 a month. More than enough to cover my loan payment, and then some. The next morning, Ethan parked that red Porsche perfectly centered inside B19, with the dealership logo facing directly toward the elevators. The exact route Brandon used every day coming down from the penthouse. I swear to God, it was like performance art. Every resident in the building saw it. Every valet saw it. Every delivery driver saw it. And Brandon completely lost his mind. The first towing attempt happened 3 days later. I got a call at work from a tow company asking if the Porsche was authorized to park there. I said yes, absolutely. 20 minutes later, Ethan texted me a blurry photo of Brandon screaming at the tow truck driver in the garage. The second towing attempt happened the next week. Same result. Then Brandon tried going through the HOA. But the HOA attorney confirmed exactly what I already knew. B19 was privately owned property outside direct association control. Nothing they could do. Watching powerful people discover limitations for the first time is honestly one of the funniest experiences on earth, because they always react like physics itself has personally betrayed them. Brandon called me again after that. No more laughter this time. Straight to business. $40,000. Then 50. I turned him down every single time. By then the money barely mattered. Because every morning when Brandon walked through that garage and saw his rival's bright red Porsche sitting in his spot, he had to relive the fact that he created the entire situation himself. And the craziest part? If he'd just moved the Range Rover the first day I left that polite little note, none of this would have happened. You know what's funny about all this? People hear the story and assume the victory was buying the parking space. It wasn't. The real victory happened way earlier, the moment I stopped begging to be treated fairly by people who already decided I didn't matter. Because that's the trap in situations like these, especially in HOA buildings, corporate apartments, or anywhere power gets filtered through money and status. You think if you explain yourself clearly enough, stay calm enough, act reasonable enough, eventually the system will correct itself. But sometimes the system isn't broken at all. Sometimes it's functioning exactly the way the powerful people inside it want it to function. And once you understand that, your entire mindset changes. According to standard procedure, most people escalate emotionally when they feel disrespected. They yell, threaten, slam doors, post angry Facebook rants nobody reads. But the people sitting at the top of these little power structures already know how to handle emotional reactions. They deal with angry tenants every day. What they don't expect is patience, documentation, research, structure. From a legal perspective, Brandon probably thought he was untouchable because in his world, money solved friction automatically. If there was a problem, you paid someone to make it disappear. That mentality works right up until ownership records enter the conversation because paperwork doesn't care how expensive your watch is. And honestly, that's why this whole thing became so satisfying to me. Not because I won, but because for once, consequences moved uphill instead of downhill. Usually the regular person absorbs all the inconvenience, while the wealthy guy barely notices the damage. This time, he had to walk past it every single day. Bright red, impossible to ignore. This is a psychological trap powerful people create for themselves constantly. They become so accustomed to getting their way that they stop calculating risk. Brandon could have avoided the entire disaster by showing the smallest amount of respect to someone he viewed as socially beneath him. But entitlement changes your brain after a while. You stop seeing boundaries as real. You stop imagining that smaller people can become larger problems. The lesson here is, quiet people are dangerous when they finally stop accepting unfairness as normal. Not dangerous in a violent way, not movie villain revenge fantasy dangerous. I mean strategically dangerous. Calm dangerous. Spreadsheet dangerous. The kind of dangerous that reads HOA bylaws at midnight while everybody else is asleep. And honestly, those are the people you should never underestimate. Even now I still get occasional updates from old neighbors in that building. Apparently Brandon eventually moved out after about a year because residents kept joking about the sponsored parking spot every time they saw him in the elevator. The Porsche became this weird local legend in the garage. And every time I hear that, I laugh because the entire chain reaction started with one tiny act of arrogance nobody thought twice about. So yeah, if there's any takeaway from this story, it's that respect is usually a lot cheaper than revenge. And if you enjoyed this kind of slow-burn real-world karma story, let me know down in the comments because trust me, HOA drama gets way crazier than people realize.